You're listening to 3CR Community Radio 855 AM on digital and online. 3CR Radical Radio.
In stunning reversal, protests leave Sri Lanka's ruling dynasty teetering. In 2020, Mahinda Rajapaksa won elections to become Sri Lanka's Prime Minister, serving under his brother and President Gotabaya. In 2021, another sibling, Basil, was named Finance Minister, tightening the family's hold on power. Less than a year later, the country's preeminent political dynasty is in trouble as protesters take to the streets, making demands that would have been unthinkable before the economic crisis struck, that the president steps down. How much of the economic crisis can be placed at the feet of the Rajapaksa dynasty? And how powerful has this dynasty been in the island nation of Sri Lanka? To answer these questions and others, I spoke with Lionel Bobuji, former leader of a mass liberation movement, eventually forced into political exile, now living in Melbourne. Lionel, how far back can we trace the Rajapaksa family and its influence in Sri Lankan politics and the economy?
I mean, Rajapaksa family has been in politics for a very, very long time, starting probably in the 1930s. But then there are branching of this Rajapaksa family in different ways. There were progressive part of Rajapaksa family, but then, they have been either isolated, disappeared from the scene for some reason or other. This Rajapaksa family is a branch off from that Rajapaksa family which started poor when they originally started in Hambantota district in Sri Lanka. That is the southernmost corner of Sri Lanka. This would have been in the 1950s and so on. Then gradually this Mahinda Rajapaksa family came into the scene, properly seen maybe in the 1990s, 1988, 88, 90. I had an interaction with him, Mahinda Rajapaksa. He was at that time one of the ministers, I think. He was trying to influence me at a meeting, but was able to veer away from that influence. Since that time, there have been many stories about how the Rajapaksa family has been driving their election campaigns. He has been very popular in a sense in Hambantota district as an elected MP for such a long time. But at the same time, I have heard horrible stories about how this election campaign through many crimes, I would say, without going into detail because though some of them may be allegations. And those allegations include murder. Main point in my memory is when in the year 2000, when Ms. Chandrika Bandaranaike was the president of the country, there was an attempt to bring up a new constitution, and a constitutional package was drafted by Dr. Neelan Tiruchellam, one of the brightest Tamil intellectuals, and then from the southern side, Dr. Jampati Vikramaratne, then I think there were many other people involved. That constitutional draft was mainly addressing the major issues in Sri Lanka, not the economic ones, but the national question, sort of with regard to the rights of non-majoritarian communities in Sri Lanka. And that was opposed by Mahinda Rajapaksa and group. That is how that was defeated. The regime at that time couldn't even bring up that bill to the parliament for discussion. Within the internal party discussions, that was defeated, and Chandrika was not able to bring it to the parliament. So that is when I noted extra chauvinist character of the Rajapaksa family. Since then, Rajapaksa family has become stronger and stronger, not only politically, but wealth-wise. There is a background. We can talk about that later. Politically speaking, in 2005, when Chandrika Bandaranaike's 2 terms as president were over, the SLFP gave nomination to Mahinda Rajapaksa as the presidential candidate. And in 2005, I think the JVP did something very, very criminal, I would say, in the sense Mahinda Rajapaksa was backed up And it was mainly the JVP campaign that brought Mahinda Rajapaksa to power as the president. At that election, Mahinda Rajapaksa family used some of the powerful people inside their party, like Mangal Samaravira and somebody else, which I can't offhand remember the name. He met with an accident, the so-called accident, and he passed away. Some funds were handed over to the LTTE, and LTTE was asked to boycott elections at that time, not to vote for any party, because if they voted, they would have voted against Mahinda Rajapaksa. But, by convincing them to boycott the elections, Mahinda Rajapaksa was able to win the elections and he became the president. 2007-8 period, there were very unfortunate incidents in Sri Lanka. Especially, I would say, the LTT was also responsible for that. I can remember that they cutting off water to some of the villages, single villages in the frontal area. That initiated the psychological warfare of the Mahinda Rajapaksa regime to convince Sinhala people that we have to militarily annihilate the LTTE. That is how it started. So we can't blame only one side. What I'm saying is basically there have been mistakes done by many groups, all the parties to the conflict. Then Mahinda Rajapaksa was able to convince the whole world that terror threat in the world due to extreme Islamic fundamentalist groups were rising. And Mahinda Rajapaksa and them were able to convince most of the powerful countries in the world, say from the Soviet Union to China, the Russia, China, America, India, Pakistan, and so on. They all helped Mahinda Rajapaksa regime to defeat the LTT. They provided military intelligence. They had naval cordons around Sri Lanka. So all the parties helped. And Mahinda Rajapaksa was able to militarily defeat the militant Tamil movement in the north and east, but that didn't defeat the just demands of the Tamil people, Tamil-speaking people, not only in the north and east, but in the plantation sector. Or Tamil people we identify as Malaya workers, Malaya people. In 2009, with the defeat of the LTTE, the Sinhala people, majority of the Sinhala people in the south, started venerating the Rajapaksa family. And during that time, there had been embezzlement of funds, and they became the richest. Most of them were highly affluent people, not only in Sri Lanka, in the world. Recently, in Pandora papers, there was some exposure as to how they took away money from Sri Lanka, funds. There are allegations that they have invested this black money in many places. Some of the money may be in those islands where Malcolm Turnbull also have some funds, and in Uganda, in Maldives, in many other places, even in Australia, there are investments, not only by Mahinda Rajapaksa family, but also by many politicians who have been able to siphon the wealth of Sri Lanka, use that as investments in Australia. In that way, Australia is also becoming a famous place for investing black money.
I saw a figure of $5.3 billion that the Rajapaksa family had taken out of the country. Where does all that money come from for them to take it?
There are several ways they have done it. According to the information available in public knowledge, they have used many ways of accumulating funds. One easy way was through Chinese loans and contracts and investments and so on. Whenever there is a project, not only from China, any party who is coming from overseas to invest in Sri Lanka, there have been many instances where information is in public domain. Rajapaksas have demanded very high commissions. As far as I remember, they have asked sometimes 40% to 80% commissions of whole projects. So that means the people who conduct these projects, manage these projects are not able to achieve whatever the outcomes, project outcomes. So some of the people have refused outright, and they didn't want to make investments in Sri Lanka. But according to what I heard, say for example, these highways they built using Chinese investment, they provided high commissions, and from the contracts they have given cuts to the family. Then at the same time, they forced out some of the rich families in Sri Lanka, and they forced them to hand over their wealth to the Rajapaksa family. Now, there is an email which is circulating now at the moment, where one of the richest families in Sri Lanka was Lalit Kotalawala. This Selinco group, they were a very rich, one of the corporations like in Sri Lanka. And Lalit Kotalawala was taken into custody. He is an elderly gentleman. He was ultimately, what he says is, he was forced to hand over all his wealth to the Rajapaksa family. No wonder he has become a billionaire. And then through other means, in Colombo, I think there is a racket going on, and there are lawyers involved, there are banks involved. They are all associated in ripping off land, highly valuable land, not only in Colombo, in several areas in the whole island. They redraft deeds, and there are some people in the courts who are involved, in the judiciary as well. There is a huge racket which has enabled Rajapaksa family to acquire land. Otherwise, how could an ordinary family who started their lives as simple human beings in Hambantota, within 2-3 decades, become the richest in Sri Lanka, with many properties, many investments, almost everywhere in the island? Their salaries won't enable them to achieve such a status as MPs, as ministers, even as a prime minister. Or their salaries are not enough. They are whatever they get as perks, even they can't account for them. There is no way in Sri Lanka we can ask for that sort of information. They refuse to give that information, and there is no way we can find the proper means of transparency and accountability to investigate or to find out what the real situation is.
What is the connection between the Rajapaksa family and the military?
The main person who was in the military is Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who is the current president. He joined, I think, I can't exactly remember the year, but probably in the 60s or 70s, he joined the military. And then he grew up in ranks. I think he became a lieutenant or so. But within the Sri Lankan armed forces, it is not only the Rajapaksas who have influenced. From the very beginning, I would say from the 1950s, I could remember when I was school kid in 1956, when there were fasting campaigns in the north and east, Tamil leaders who are coming to Colombo to fast. There were non-violent campaigns to protest against the government policy of official language and whatever other means the government used to discriminate against the Tamil community. There were non-violent protests. I remember Mr. Bandaranaike sending his relation, Colonel Udugama, to the north and east, asking him to do whatever he could to suppress the opposition. And actually, that is how this repressive movement started, using the army to suppress any opposition in the north and east. That, intensified gradually, and it has come up to later on, sort of a very, very highly repressive situation. Now, coming back to Rajapaksa family, the influence is Gotabaya Rajapaksa was a prominent person of the Gajaba regiment. Gajaba regiment of the army has the most influence from Rajapaksa family, and they are the people who are used sort of a risky situation to safeguard Rajapaksas. In 2009, with the defeat of the LTTE, I think the nationalist forces within the armed forces played a major role. I will just cite one incident. When there were Thimphu talks between the LTTE and the government, that were peace talks to de-escalate the situation, there were certain conditions agreed by the Sri Lankan government, sending some of the essential items needed to the people in the north and east of Sri Lanka. So they agreed to release some of those censored items, like I think cement for building houses and so on. It was the armed forces who, at the ground level, blocked that whole thing. They didn't allow whatever the agreement to come into force. So within the armed forces, there is a strong nationalist pro-Sinhala current which blocks all the attempts to de-escalate tensions among the communities in Sri Lanka, especially against Tamils and Muslims. Sort of whatever the problems, whatever the solutions, even the governments have been trying to, they have sabotaged. It is a serious situation, and still after 2009, the influence of Rajapaksa family has become very strong. Within the armed forces, I think their influence became intense after the war in 2009. Currently, there is a strong section, including people like Shavendra De Silva and some others who are supporting the Rajapaksa family to the hilt, because security forces have been provided with business opportunities, investment opportunities, and they have been given very plum positions in diplomatic services and so on. What I'm saying is, even in the security forces, sort of like, for example, in the north and east, they have started business ventures like farms, restaurants, tourist hotels, and so on.
The topic for discussion is the present crisis in Sri Lanka, and I'm speaking with Lionel Burpagee, former leader of a mass liberation movement in that country.
Like in Burma, Myanmar, military has been given some opportunities so that they also have become one of the privileged classes or the elite in the security forces. They are also part and parcel of the ruling elite. They are not only politicians, the bureaucrats, there are some bureaucrats and some of the people in the security forces, they all work together.
Does the Rajapaksa family also have contacts with the far-right Buddhist movement?
Yes, that is what I mentioned, sort of saying far-right Sinhala extreme movements. I mean, it is a worldwide trend, sort of far-right movements use extremism in terms of ethnic differences or religious differences, and they make use of those to power. Sometimes they create incidents where, that will heighten tension and polarize, fragment the society so that, I think we all know what Trump did, what Putin does, what, sort of say, in terms of raising nationalism. In Sri Lanka, it's the same situation, but it is much worse in the sense the Easter bomb attacks, which will be 3 years for that event on the 21st of April. Those incidents helped the nationalists to come to power. And that was helped by the Buddhist monks, the extreme Sinhala, far-right, chauvinist groups, and they created those groups. Sometimes there is information that those extremist groups are funded by the intelligence agencies of the government, and like Ravana group, and then there was Sinhala Ravaya, and so on. I don't know. I mean, I can't exactly say whether they are government agents, but there is in public there are reports that some of those extreme organizations were funded by the military intelligence and other intelligence services of the government of Sri Lanka. They have been creating incidents, sort of against Tamils, against Muslims, and they create something and then arouse nationalism and, anti-Tamil, anti-Muslim sentiments in the south of Sri Lanka. Those sentiments have been used for certain extreme groups to come to power.
Well, look into what they are encountering at the moment. It's described as the worst financial crisis since independence. How has it got to this stage?
We have to look at the crisis initially, say 74 years back, when Sri Lanka was given independence by the British. At that time, due to certain factors, Korean War and so on, there was an economic boom. And at that time, the situation in Sri Lanka was not bad. I would say pretty good. In the sense, people were given subsidies and education was free, health was free, and, all sort of things. But then after the Korean War boom, end of the Korean War, the situation changed because we were exporting tea, rubber, and coconut. Rubber prices were very high during the Korean War, and the prices came down in the world market, and that affected Sri Lanka pretty badly. The government, instead of cutting down the unnecessary imports that went to satisfy the needs of the ruling elite, the affluent sectors of Sri Lanka, they didn't cut down that. But what they did is they tried to remove concessions or subsidies that was given to the ordinary people, the workers. And that is how the general strike in 1953 came. It created the situation, and however, the whole thing didn't succeed because we were not able to get rid of the government at that time. But, the removal of subsidies was temporarily stopped. But then at different stages, they tried to get rid of those subsidies. And the ruling elite of Sri Lanka has been safeguarding their interests and privileges right through. And there have been imports. This crisis became because of the welfare policies of the government. No, it is not the welfare policies of the government. The people need to be supported because people don't have means of surviving. The issue was the imports were more than exports. That generally grew up, that created the worst situation. From 1971 to 77, the crisis was so bad, the government stopped imports and closed the economy, imposed food restrictions and no rice for people to eat, and they asked people to eat potatoes and so on, and that created strong opposition movement against the regime. But then that was used by the United National Party, who advocated neoliberalist solution to the problem. When they were elected with 5/6 majority to the parliament, they created the neoliberal economy. They opened up the whole thing. I think that was the first time in the world a country opened up their economy 100% to investment. What happened is afterwards, the exports grew because there were some value-added products like clothes and some other items that generated somewhere. And then with the opening of the economy, there were opportunities. So foreign exchange started coming from the people who are employed overseas like that. And then there were opportunities for people to come to developed countries like Australia, Canada, States, and so on. And they are sending back money. So the situation became much more bearable, probably ameliorated in terms of intensity. We were able to carry on for a while. Then the situation got worse again due to the war and due to ruling elite embezzling funds. After 1977, with the imposition of neoliberal economy, the corruption became more intensified. That doesn't mean corruption didn't exist before that. There was corruption. I have personally experienced corrupt situations in Sri Lanka in the 60s and 70s. But what I'm talking is, after 1978, after the imposition of neoliberal economy, the situation grew much worse, charging commissions for each and every project, going out of the tender processes to hand over projects to their favorites, disassembling all the established industries in Sri Lanka. But say, for example, by 1970s, we had a good clothes sector, tire manufacturing, steel, hardware, and so on. So those factories were dismantled and sold to the private sector. That way, I think, that created this situation where gradually it worsened because the ruling class didn't care for the ordinary people. Their subsidies were gradually, even if the lowest sections of the society were given, say, for example, 2,000 rupees a month, that is about, less than $10, I would say. The purchasing power of that money went down the hill, as time goes, and they are not able to afford. But the rich, the affluent, the elite, ruling elite, and the other people who are associated with that, their families, their collaborators, their henchmen, they were given the opportunity to exploit all the resources of the country by granting rights to exploit, from sand to mineral resources, plantations, and so on. That grew worse. The imports grew heavily, and that created this situation. And after, especially, the government says that the situation became worse because of the COVID situation and the Ukraine war. No, the crisis was apparent much before that. And the crisis has been there in Sri Lanka growing, and then, governments will take some measures to ameliorate the situation, but then again it grows. So the situation has become very bad now. It has developed into a situation where the government may have to go for a default, hard default, where the government is not in a position to pay back their debt, and not only the premiums, but also debt service, the interest payments, not only for overseas debt, but also the domestic debt. The government is printing money, billions of rupees. The accountant was installed as, that was a political henchman. He was installed as the head of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. And he doesn't have any understanding about how economy works. So he just started printing money. That printing money has caused inflation, heavy inflation. The value of the dollar, for example, I can remember in the 1970s, probably it would have been 10 rupees a dollar, 15 rupees a dollar. Now it has come closer to 300 rupees a dollar. So inflation is very high. People are fighting because they can't survive. They don't have food, they don't have fuel, they don't have electricity, they don't have paper to conduct examinations, they don't have health care, no medication. They are facing problems everywhere and they can't survive. So people who are not associated with political parties, any political organization, they have come to the streets and they are protesting. They are fighting for their survival. There are two things I need to mention here. One is the government's reaction has been to repress, but then that failed because the opposition created instability within the government ranks. And some of the MPs, I think about 50 odd MPs moved away from the government ranks. That created a situation where the government has the simple majority but not the two-thirds majority. The emergency that was declared by Gotabaya Rajapaksa immediately after the protest had to be withdrawn because they couldn't get it approved through Parliament. The protests have created the wave which is ongoing. Unless this is guided in a proper way, could ultimately end up in a bloodbath. And if we talk of bloodbaths, this will be the fourth bloodbath if it occurs. Government has been trying to make use of every opportunity to repress these people, suppress the opposition, these people who are protesting. And now, apparently, from my view, government is trying to create an opportunity to do so. They might use psychological warfare. They will create an incident as they did in the past. There are much information coming out that government is working out some sort of a strategy to end up this whole protest movement in a bloodbath. Yesterday, Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa, the brother of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, addressed the nation. From that speech, I could get hints that they have been war heroes. They did this in 2009. What it implies is this is not something new. We can tackle the situation. they may try to create a situation where ordinary people in the society to move away from supporting the protesters. It is a very serious situation. I think the left parties and the people who want reform in the city, who are looking for justice and fairness, need to concentrate on this, focus on this, and see in what way they could expand this protest movement so that something positive can be achieved at the end.
And many thanks to Lionel Verpiche.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.